please. Hello. It is also my great honor to introduce Professor Malmqvist. I know you're all here to. Oh. Before we begin, I'd just like to say a few words about Professor Malmqvist's life, his work, and also a brief introduction to the talk he's going to give to us today. Professor Malmqvist was born in 1924 in Sweden. As a university student, he studied classics, etc., with a special focus on Roman law. Later, he turned to Chinese literature and linguistics and studied under the great Bernhard Karlgren. I know in the last few years, Professor Malmqvist wrote a biography of his teacher called Life of a Scholar. After finishing his studies, Professor Malmqvist went to China between 1948 and 1950, where he did fieldwork investigations in Chinese dialects. Then he began teaching. He taught at London University, Australian National University, and Stockholm University for about a duration of 30 years. During his long and distinguished career, Professor Malmqvist has established himself as one of the most important sinologists of our time. His many works on Chinese literature, historical linguistics, syntax, textual criticism, religion, culture, and so on have won him worldwide acclaim. In 1985, he was elected to the Swedish Academy, which is the academy that awards the Nobel Prize every year. He's one of 15 members of the Academy. Professor Malmqvist has also received honorary degrees from Charles University in Prague and the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Professor Malmqvist is also one of the foremost translators of Chinese literature into Swedish. He's translated works such as 水浒, 西游记, and many other works into Swedish, including contemporary writers like Mo Yan and slipped my mind, the other Nobel Prize winner. Oh, Gao Jie, yeah. And what's even more amazing, I think, is he also has translated William Blake, the English poet, into Swedish, and he's also translated from Swedish into English. So basically, 3 languages. He's very fluent in all 3. I think he's currently working on a translation of Yang Mu into English. I read a few poems, and they're outstanding. Okay, I could go on about his achievements, but I think I should yield the floor to Professor Malmqvist. So please give him a warm welcome.
Dear Professor Tang, dear Professor Hu, dear friends, I'm very happy to be here. And the title of my talk today is Words and Silences, but I can assure you that I will deal mainly with problems of translation. It has been suggested that what can be said in one language may be said in any other language. I long wished to believe in that statement, but 60 years' experience as a translator has forced me to concede that the statement must be taken with a grain of salt. This insight originates in the appreciation of the fact that the realm of language not always is in accord with the realm of reality. The great variety of adjectival expressions denoting colors, which enables a Lappish reindeer herdsman to identify the animals in his herd, could not possibly be efficiently conveyed to a Palestine shepherd through translation. Words, someone help me to, thank you. Words may be likened to labels, which be placed on things and phenomena within us and in the world around us. It is our mother tongue that provides us with these labels, which we have to accept, whether we like them or not. The Chinese thinker Xunzi, already in the 3rd century before our era, advanced the theory that the relation between the signifying word and the signified object is totally arbitrary. He does that in a short essay called Tonguing, the rectification of names. Well over 2,000 years passed before that truth was revealed to the Western world through Ferdinand de Saussure's famous series of lectures published in 1916 under the title Cours de linguistique générale. The longer a word is used, the more meanings it attracts. The more meanings are assigned to a label in a given language, the more difficult it is to find a semantically matching word in another language. The ancient Chinese character 1, which dates back to the end of the 2nd millennium before our era, presents a long chain of semantic development. The earliest written form of the word shows a man with a tattooed breast. The original meaning of the word was carved or painted line, from which 2 parallel semantic chains eventually developed: pattern, ornament, culture, graph, script, literature. The English label culture is translated into the Chinese label Wenhua. But the semantic difference between the 2 labels is enormous. The expression 有文化, to possess culture, may, in the Chinese inland, in the poor country village in northern Shanxi, be used to characterize a person who has been taught to write the 3 graphs composing his or her name. In one of his works, the Swedish writer Eva Lo Johansson writes, "I well know that words are traitorous. Old words are like vessels that haven't been washed after having been used. New words taste of the new material. Old words were colored a long time ago. New words are colorless, and the raw material shines through. It is, after all, we human beings that employ words in our service. But some pretty pedants assert that we are employed by the words." One of the greatest Western poets of the 20th century asserts that the failure to formulate an inexpressible experience is indicative of the fact that language has lost its symbolic power. He writes, "Words strain, crack, and sometimes break under the burden. Under the tension, slip, slide, perish. Decay with imprecision will not stay in place, will not stay still." Some of you may recognize the quote. It is from T.S. Eliot, his 4 quartets, the poem Burnt Norton, one of the greatest poems in modern British literature. Some languages are, without doubt, thanks to their structure, better suited to express certain notions than others. The medieval ontological proof, an ontological proof is a proof of existence, a proof of God's existence. So there is a medieval ontological proof that goes Deus bonus est, ergo Deus est, which is quite impossible to translate into Chinese. It simply cannot be done. If I try to translate it, I will get the following: 上帝善，因此上帝在. It doesn't make sense. It's a nonsense utterance. Why? Because the ontological proof, Deus bonus est, ergo Deus est, can without any semantic loss be translated into all Western languages that possess a verb with a double function. A verb functioning as a copular verb, and at the same time serving as an intransitive verb meaning to exist. Latin esse is one of those verbs. English to be, German zu sein, French être, Swedish vara, all have this double function, to be a copular verb linking a predicative to its subject and at the same time serving as a verb meaning to exist. Any attempt to translate this ontological proof into a language such as Chinese, which lacks a verb with this double function, is bound to fail. You simply cannot do it. Russian is another language which does not possess a copular verb. But obviously, the Orthodox Church in Russia ought to be able to express this ontological proof in its language. Since the Russian language is impossible, and they simply, in Church Slavonic, used the Latin copula est. They borrowed this Latin copula est to express this ontological proof. So that is, they are really cheating in that regard. And what was once accepted as a theological truth may be seen as a linguistic characteristic common to most, but not all, European languages. Toward the end of the 19th century, when Chinese intellectuals began to take an interest in Western ideologies, Hegel's dialectic system was introduced to China. Of central importance in Hegel's dialectic system is the theory that each thesis, thought, or notion that originates in isolation is bound to attract its opposite, its antithesis. The result of this process is a synthesis that is raised to the position of thesis on the next higher level in the system. Each thesis is a point of departure for the creation of a new entity. The synthesis becomes a thesis that is cancelled out by the antithesis. Reality is lodged in the process of evolution, in which one state necessarily turns into its opposite. This theory leads to the conception of the necessity of social evolution. Now, to establish this dialectic system, Hegel, who was German, employs the verb aufheben in the three different meanings. Aufheben can mean aufbewahren, to preserve. It can mean aufhören lassen, to cancel out, and erhöhen, to raise up. The antithesis cancels out the thesis. The synthesis which preserves both the thesis and the antithesis is raised up to serve as thesis on the next higher level in the system, where it in turn is cancelled out by the antithesis. Now, languages lacking a verb with the same threefold meaning as German aufheben, have great difficulty in reproducing the Hegelian language game. Now my Swedish language has a verb upphäva, which is etymologically connected with aufheben. And that Swedish verb has two of the three meanings of German aufheben, but not all three. When attempts were made in the early 1920s to translate Hegel's dialectic system into Chinese, the frustrated translators created the gruesome translation verb aufheben, to serve for Hegel's aufheben. It's a grotesque term. When Chinese Marxists in the 1930s tried to improve upon the translation, they neglected to accept that meaning of aufheben, namely aufbewahren, to preserve, which in Hegel's system vouches for the continuity in the development of society. That neglect may be motivated by wishful thinking. Perhaps the young Marxist translators, in the second meaning of the verb aufhören lassen, saw an instrument with the aid of which they overnight would be able to overturn the old and create a new society. It is highly interesting to note that Hegel's dialectic system has an exact counterpart in a work by the Chinese monk Zhizang, which represents the culmination of the Buddhist Mahayana philosophy. Zhizang proposes the theory of the double truth, the erdi, the worldly and the heavenly truth. You could also speak about the conventional and the absolute truth. You could speak of the temporal truth and the eternal truth. And these double truths operate on three levels, exactly as Hegel's system. On each level, the worldly truth is negated by the heavenly truth. The synthesis is raised to the next higher level of abstraction, where it serves as the worldly truth. In the heavenly truth on the third level, everything is absorbed in the undifferentiated emptiness that comprises both this world and nirvana, Nibbana. Thereby, even the Buddhist doctrine of redemption is shown to be an illusion. True redemption can only be reached when the seeker, on a purely intuitive way, experiences the emptiness that dissolves our illusionary manifoldness of existence and embraces both all and nil. Especially grave misunderstandings may arise when words are transferred from one cultural milieu to another. Many translations result from unconscious and perhaps conscious and even necessary distortions. When Indian missionaries and Chinese converts from the 3rd century of our era began to translate the subtle philosophy of Mahayana Buddhism into Chinese, they consciously employed terms that had been coined within both the Confucian and the Taoist school. To the Confucianist, Tao, the way, the norm, signifies the cosmic order that is maintained through the interaction between the three powers, earth, heaven, and man, represented by the ruler. To the Taoist, Tao represents the absolute, a reality lacking properties, resting in itself, which, while comprising all appearances in the world of man and in the universe, a reality lying beyond both word and thought. To the Buddhist, Tao represents Dharma, the teaching, Buddha's law. The term Xiaoxun, filial piety, had to do for the Sanskrit term Sila, which means moral conduct. The Taoist term Wu-wei, abstention from all conscious striving, was borrowed to signify nirvana. While these translations may have enticed some Confucianists and Taoists to join the important religion, they at the same time were instrumental in distorting the Buddhist creed. My discourse on the translation of Hegel's dialectics and the subtle philosophy of Indian Mahayana texts into Chinese prompts me to say a few words about my own view on the craft of translation. I have always insisted that the ideal translator is a craftsman, a skilled craftsman, and not a creator. The poet is a creator, and that is really what the name poet means. But the translator is a craftsman, a skilled craftsman, ideally. What a translator has to work with are texts, and these texts may be structured in a variety of ways. They may be cut up into segments of varying length, which are linked together, but no prosodic rules other than those inherent in the language itself. Other text segments may have been linked together by more or less strict rules which govern the length of the segments, the placing of stressed and unstressed syllables, casuras and euphonic elements such as rhyme and alliteration. The task of the translator is to transfer as well as he or she can the message of the original text, even that part of the message which is carried by the form and the structure of the original. Now, the difference between two languages is sometimes so great that any attempt to transpose poetic forms from the one language into the other is doomed to fail. Some 50 or 60 years ago, I experimented with a kind of asyntactic, non-syntactic translation of classical Chinese poetry into Swedish, with utter disregard for the morphological and syntactical demands of the Swedish language. Here is an example transposed into a non-syntactic English of a short lyrical poem entitled Zhangxue, A River Snow, by the Tang poet Liu Zongyuan. I read it first in Chinese. 千山鸟飞绝，万径人踪灭。孤舟蓑笠翁，独钓寒江雪。And now a non-syntactic transference of the words. Thousand mountain bird fly sever. 10,000 path man footprint extinguish. Solitary boat, rain cap, bamboo hat, old man. Alone fish, cold river, snow. When you translate classical Chinese poetry into a Western language, the target language forces you to specify what is not specified in the original. You have to decide for yourself whether the nouns have definite or indefinite reference, and whether they should be given singular or plural form. Since tense is not formally expressed in classical Chinese, the translator's Western language forces him or her to decide whether the action or the state referred to pertains to the past, the present, or the future. The universality and the timelessness that characterize the original Chinese poem are lost in translation. Much of the lyrical poetry of the Tang and the Song period is tonal, requiring a strict antithetical arrangement of level and inflected tones within the verse and the stanza. These tonal features cannot, of course, be mirrored in translation into a non-tonal language. Again, the regular placing of the caesura in 5 and 7 syllabic verse, which are the dominant metrical forms in classical Chinese poetry, cannot possibly be carried over in translation. An approximation of the original meter has been achieved by the eminent British sinologist and translator Arthur Waley, who adopted the sprung rhythm characterizing the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins, a rather free iambic meter with occasionally added trochees and a free use of unstressed syllables. Waley's translations, in which each syllable in the original poem is matched by one stressed syllable in the translation, were highly praised by both T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound. As one or more unstressed syllables normally occur between the stressed syllables, the line becomes considerably longer in the translation. The caesuras, the pauses in classical Chinese poetry, can be regarded as silences which help to impress on the reader or listener a feeling for the metrical structure of a poem. The caesura of 5-syllabic poetry invariably falls after the second syllable. 事物总竞争. At 15, I followed the army afield. It is interesting to note that the fixed metrical caesura sometimes interferes with the syntactical structure of the line in which it occurs. One example of this is the well-known poem by the Tang poet Jia Dao. I read a few lines. 松下问童子，言时采药去。松下问童子. Under the pine, I asked the young boy, 言时采药去. And he says, my master has gone to pick herbs. Now, if you transpose that last line into prose, you will have to say 言时采药去. But here the caesura forces the reader to read 言时采药去. In 7-syllabic poetry, there are 2 caesuras, one short after the second, and one slightly longer after the 4th syllable. 少小离家老大回. 少小离家老大回. When young I left the home, as an old man I returned. That's a 7-syllabic poem. And I have, talking about 7-syllabic poetry, I have always wondered why there is no epic poetry in Chinese literature. 中国文学里头没有史诗。7-syllabic old verse, 7-syllabic 古诗 is an excellent tool for the writing of 7-syllabic poetry. The line I just quoted, 少小离家老大回, contains no less than 3 sentence forms. 少小离家老大回. Such a meter is very fast. It can tell a story very rapidly. And this is just what is needed in epic poetry. A meter that can tell a story quickly. And you have that in the 7-syllabic 故事 in China, but it's never been used, and that is very, very strange. I myself looked upon the thesuras of 5-syllabic and 7-syllabic poetry as metrically conditioned narrative silences. It is interesting to compare the thesuras with those occurring in the 6-syllabic poetry. Here an example, a 6-syllabic quatrain by the less well-known Tang poet Wei Yuandan. 古木寒鸦山径，小桥流水人家。昨夜前村盛雪，阳春又到梅花。Old trees, frozen crows, mountain path, small bridge, flowing water, human dwelling. Last night in the next village, deep snow. Warm spring again visits the prunus flowers. I'm sure that many of you have come to think of a late echo of that poem, namely Ma Zhiyuan's wonderful Sanqu to the tune 天净沙。枯藤老树昏鸦，小桥流水人家。古道西风瘦马，夕阳西下，断肠人在天涯。The first verb in that stanza occurs in the 4th line there. First you have 3 lines of nouns, 故乡老树 and so on. And in the 4th line you have 夕阳西下，断肠人在天涯。You may object my reading of the last line there, 断肠人在天涯. Many would read, I think, 断肠人在天涯. I couldn't do that because it would go against my feeling for the form of the poem. You have to accept that the verb 在 is separated from its object, 天涯. With a vine, old trees, evening grass, small bridge, flowing water, human dwelling. Old road, west wind, lean horse. The sun descends in the west, a heartbroken man at the end of the world. I'm sorry, I have to continue with another 6-syllabic poem because I think this 6-syllabic poetry is so excellent, and it has been swept under the carpet in Chinese literary history. If you look up, if you read through the Tang Shi Sanbai Shou, you won't find a single example of a 6-syllabic poem. And you can go to almost any large anthology of Chinese Tang poetry without finding a single example of this wonderful text. That again is amazing. But in the Tang period, you see, there were some minor poets. They were not the greatest poets. Some minor poets who wrote some magnificent 6-syllabic poetry. One of them was Wang Jian, the poem I read now called 江南三代 by Wang Jian. 扬州桥边小树，长干势力伤人。3年不得消息，各自百归求生。I think that is a greatly touching poem. Beside the Yangtze Bridge, a young wife. At the market of Chang'an, a merchant. For 3 years they haven't heard from one another. They worship the spirits and pray to the gods, each on their own. I find this and other 6-syllabic quatrains very attractive, and I'm quite fascinated by the effect of the double thesuras, which seem to me different from the thesuras of 5-syllabic and 7-syllabic verse, in that they stress the architectonic or picturesque mood of the poem. And here I again say what I've just said, that this is very strange that it has been so little, it has attracted so few studies in the history of Chinese literature. Sexual abuse poetry has been written in China for nearly 2,000 years, and the time period was a golden age of such poetry. And yet, this is a poetic genre almost unknown to the general reader. It is interesting to note that much beautiful sexual epic poetry was written by less well-known poets classified as minor poets. The term minor poet is exceedingly difficult to translate into Chinese. 次等的诗人本土, since that term has a depreciatory connotation, which is not present in the English term. 非主流的诗人 may be a better translation. A minor poet may write truly excellent poetry, but of another kind than that produced by a major poet. I have gone into some detail here in discussing this poetry because I firmly believe that a translator will have to account for, as well as he can, the outer form of whatever he translates, be it prose or poetry. And he must very keenly observe all the features of the original work, even if he cannot reproduce it in his translation. Whenever I give a talk on translation to a Chinese audience, I expect to be asked what I think about Yan Fu's three principles, Xin Daya, faithfulness, expressiveness, and elegance. There will be next week, I think, a conference in Taipei on discussing Yan Fu's translation and the three principles. That I thoroughly endorse the first two principles, the Xin Da, should be clear from what I have already said. But the third principle, elegance, must be treated with great care. Allow me to elaborate this point. In his magnificent work, After Babel, Aspects of Language and Translation from 1975, George Steiner points out that translation, among other things, is a work of self-denial, demanding that the translator serve the original rather than imposing himself or herself on it. But he also points out that all translating, like all reading and listening for that matter, is a work of editing, a work of interpretation determined by subjective and contextual factors. If the poet is a maker and creator, which indeed is the original meaning of the word, then the translator is ideally a highly skilled craftsman. And we know that in ancient times, in both Western and Eastern civilizations, craftsmen were slaves. Self-denial is one of the cardinal virtues of slaves. The translator must imitate the author of the original work, and his translation must be a likeness of the original work. The translator must never strive to excel of the author, although the literary qualities of the translation occasionally, and for various reasons, beyond the control of the translator, may appear to be superior to those of the original work. A skilled translator who masters the language into which he translates, normally his mother tongue, is bound to use to his best advantage such prosodic, euphonic, and musical effects as his language places at his disposal. In doing so, he may add to his translation features which are not present in the original work. Paradoxically, the more skilled the translator, and the more acutely his ear is tuned to prosodical and musical features, the farther his translation may deviate from the original text. A famous Swedish poet and man of letters of the 19th century once said, "Beautiful translations are just like beautiful women. That's to say, they are not always the most faithful ones." I just mentioned that the readability of a translation may appear to surpass that of the original text. In the first quarter of the 20th century, the learned Chinese scholar Lin Shu, who himself did not master any foreign language, translated some 130 works of Western literature into Wanyan with the aid of several competent assistants. His translation of Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare was instrumental in creating a great interest for the study of English literature in China. Dr. Hu Shi has the following to say about Lin Shu's translation. It was a tremendous task and exceedingly amusing to read the comic figures in the novels of Charles Dickens talking in the dead language of 2,000 years ago. The British translator and poet Arthur Waley voices a diametrically opposite view, saying, "Dickens inevitably becomes a rather different and, to my mind, a better writer. All the over-elaboration, the overstatement, and uncurbed garrulity disappear," says Waley. And the famous scholar-writer Chen Zhou, who achieved a complete mastery of the major European languages, somewhere states that he, in his youth, preferred to read Rider Haggard's novels in Lin Shu's translations. I don't suppose any of you have read any novel by Rider Haggard. He was at one time a writer of very successful adventure stories, some made into films. African Queen was one with Humphrey Bogart, if I remember right, and Solomon's Mines and another. But hardly, his works can hardly be considered high literature. I have recently, and to my great delight, had occasion to study the translations of Zhou Shoujuan, to my mind, one of the greatest translators of Western literature into Chinese. In 1915, at the age of 21, Zhou Shoujuan published his 欧洲名家短篇小说, short stories by famous European and American writers. The anthology contains 48 works by British, American, French, Russian, German, Portuguese, Spanish, Danish, Swedish, Dutch, Serbian and Finnish writers, but they were all done from English. His command of English was superb. I have carefully compared his translations of works by two Swedish writers, August Strindberg, the dramatist and novelist, and Selma Lagerlöf, who was a member of the Swedish Academy. And I have found his translations truly excellent. It is clear that he translated from English, a language which he really mastered. The most outstanding feature of his translations is that he translated into 4 different media, into a pre-Qin classical Chinese, a post-Han Wanyan, an early vernacular of the Shui Hou Zhuan type, and a modern colloquial Chinese. I find it utterly strange that the young radicals, who a few years after the publication of Zhou Shoujuan's great anthology fought on the barricades of the literary revolution, never acknowledged Zhou Shoujuan's tremendous achievements as a translator and introducer of Western literature. Perhaps that was due to the fact that Zhou Shoujuan also excelled in writing romantic Yuan Ya novels, which were not, that was a thing one really shouldn't do in the May 4th years. Each translator approaches work in his or her own way. To me, translation is a work of love. But this love must be tempered by recognition of the translator's twofold responsibility toward the author of the original text and to his own readers. Before starting to translate, be it a long novel or a short poem, I read the work several times, many times, in rapid succession, in order to get the feeling for the structure and the flow of the text. While reading and rereading the text, I make mental notes of passages which I know will present a challenge, and ponder about how they might be best translated. I always articulate the text silently when I read and translate, which gives me a sore throat at the end of a long day's work. The repeated readings make me feel the presence of the author's voice. When I eventually arrive at a point where my own voice and breathing are in harmony with the voice and the breathing of the author, then the work is almost done. I'm aware that my notions of the author's voice and breathing may sound like hocus pocus to many of you. I'm at loss to explain how it works, but I know that it does work. And once I feel that I have arrived at this stage, I'm ready to revise the language and the style to match those of the original text. The repeated and articulated readings of a text have an added advantage in that they help you discover features which otherwise may have been undetected. Phonological dialectal features are effectively hidden under the logographic Chinese script, but they may appear in the vocabulary and as features of both morphology and syntax. Such dialectal features as do occur must be mirrored in the translation. A translator who fails to do so is guilty of what has been called the deadly sin of normalizing and leveling. I will add a few words here about the translation of Bajin's Jia, his trilogy, Jia Shun Qiu. Only one volume has been translated, and very poorly, very poorly so, into English, published by the Weiban Zhubashi in Peking. The translator has completely missed to realize that Bajin in this trilogy, Jia Shun Qiu, uses two syntactic systems. One based on the oral Sichuanese of that time, of the late 1930s, and one on the Goyu of that time. The narrative descriptions are presented in Goyu, but the dialect is presented in Sichuan Fanyan. And that is a very important point. And the translator must somehow show that he has appreciated that that feature. Otherwise, he hasn't done his job. I personally, if I encounter works with a lot of dialect, I find corresponding dialects in my own language. As a young man, my father was a teacher and moved from one part of Sweden to another for some years. So I'm acquainted with quite a number of Swedish dialects. And then you will simply pick among your dialects those that you feel best fit into the original. Again, when translating, say, I mentioned a moment ago that translators are slaves, and they must follow the original text. When I translated the Sri Hotuan in the 1970s, I found in that work a small number of poems, poetry, doggerel, poor poetry, poetry of no literary value whatsoever. And poor poetry must be translated into poor poetry. If I were to try to make good poetry out of a poor poem, I haven't done my job as a translator. Poor poetry must be translated into poor poetry. And good poetry, then you really have to do your very best in order to present something that matches the original. In the 90s, I translated a COG into Swedish, and it may surprise you to hear that the COG contains no less than 750 poems. 750 poems, mostly tsi, and the tsi are mainly dealing with landscape and with mountainous landscapes. And Utangan must be considered the finest landscape tsi poet of his time. It is magnificent poetry. And when you're facing that, you have to do your very best to present a good translation of it. Otherwise, you have failed you may not succeed, but you must try to do your best. I mentioned the term normalizing and leveling. Now, normalizing and leveling are at the very core of the problem of literary translation. And these terms refer to the trimming out and smoothing out the text, cutting off its edges and neutralizing its very effects. The author, the creator of the text, may allow himself the freedom to deviate from all norms. He can forge new words, he can distort syntax, and he can play with the multiple senses of words. And the translator, the craftsman's slave, must do his utmost to convey such deviations in his translation. The worst case of leveling is cutting out segments of the text and adding what is not present in the text. That mustn't be done. It is very often done, and it is very often done by translators in the States, in the United States, who obey the commands of their publishers. There are cases when an American publisher finds that a certain passage is not fit to be read by the American public or readers, and then therefore he insists that the translator cuts it out. I dare say that no European translator, at least not one that I know, would ever agree to listen to or obey the commands of the publisher. He would rather not translate at all. Cultural leveling is equally reprehensible. Any source language expresses a particular world vision, which may be quite different from that of the target language. the translator should be aware of the fact that the translation of a text at the same time is a translation of a culture. Such cultural elements as may seem strange to the reader of the translation must be elucidated to him or her. I personally abhor footnotes which tend to obstruct the flow of the text. I much prefer to deal with such elements in an introduction to the translation. My introduction to my translation of the COG runs through many pages where I discuss Chinese Buddhism, Taoism, alchemy, and geography, and so on. Stylistic leveling is no less reprehensible. Every translator has his stylistic idiosyncrasies, which he may feel free to indulge in as long as he doesn't show them off in his translations. My own Swedish, both written and spoken, is rather conservative, or rather highly conservative, in that I retain certain linguistic forms that went out of fashion 50 or 60 years ago, such as the subjunctive forms of verbs. I have to be very careful to avoid such forms when I translate a colloquial Chinese text. Again, I will leave the text for another comment. Sometimes you will find that a linguistic unit functions in a way that you do not expect it to function. And you have to be very careful to try to detect those instances. If you happen to overhear a Chinese say 这块大 I imagine that most listeners would accept that to mean this piece is bigger. Not this piece is big. 这块大 this piece is bigger. So there is a double possibility of a double interpretation here. This piece is bigger, this piece is big. Now if you want to express that this piece is big, you can do that by adding the adverb 很, say 这个很大 By adding 很, you indicate that the adjectival expression to which it belongs is incomparable. It's an incomparable expression. So you eliminate the possibility of a double interpretation. And that may mean that the semantic strength of the Chinese verb 很 is less strong than the English adverb very. And that is the thing that one has to consider. It may well be that one sometimes, not always, but sometimes make a mistake by translating 很 as very, when in fact 很 has a completely different function, namely to eliminate a possibility of a double interpretation. Again, I will leave this for a moment. I will insist that translators are slaves, and they have to obey. They have to obey the original text, even if they don't quite agree with it. I translated a short story by Mo Yan some time ago called 大风, the storm. And in that novel, short story, Mo Yan describes the sky, the color of the sky, as 墨绿. The sky is 墨绿. it is ink green. Now, there you are facing a problem. Should you translate into Swedish exactly what Moya says? Ink green. No Swede has ever seen an ink green sky, but Moya has seen it. Apparently, otherwise, if he hadn't seen it, he shouldn't have written it. So Moya exists in Moya's language and in his life experience. He has seen an ink green sky. And as a translator, I have to follow and translate that into Swedish. And today I saw in the 自由时报 published some 11 Paiju poems that I wrote a few weeks ago, just for fun. And in one of the poems, I referred to bamboo paintings. I'll see if I remember it. 墨绿的天空，哎呀，朱红的竹子，板桥发牢骚。An ink green sky, high red bamboo. Red bamboos. 板桥发牢骚。 Chao is getting annoyed. Dharma Chao, the famous Qianhong bamboo painter. Once a painter of bamboos presented the emperor with red bamboos. And the emperor got quite annoyed and said, I've never seen red bamboos. And the painter said, Have your Majesty seen black bamboos? That's a story beside that. I believe that the Western translator of Chinese literature, and especially of classical poetry, is often frustrated by the pedantic and tyrannical demands of his own language, which make it impossible for him to convey the feeling of universality and timelessness which characterizes the original. Two courses are, of course, open to the translator: to throw in the towel and abstain from translating, or to struggle along, conscious of the fact that in every sentence he may be committing the sin, the deadly sin of normalizing and leveling. Silences in literary works are non-words. The non-words appearing in a telling and sometimes scaring silence, like labels. 2005 years Nobel laureate Harold Pinter, the British dramatist Harold Pinter, delegates to the reader or listener the task of giving voice to the silences in his dramas. The Norwegian playwright Jan Fosse, whose works are now being played all over the world, sometimes prefers to supply the silences in his works with prosodic labels, indicating their relative length: pause, short pause, long pause, and even longer pause, and so on. You need to stop watching in order to follow his pauses. To many, language and writing stand out as particularly important instruments for human progress. Others prefer to listen to silence. To them, belongs the Taoist thinker Zhuangzi, who lived and worked in the 4th century before our era. In the work that has been named after him, he says, "The snare exists for the sake of the hare. Once you have caught the hare, you may forget the snare. The fish trap exists for the sake of the fish. Once you have caught the fish, you may forget the fish trap. Words exist for the sake of the meaning. Once you have caught the meaning, you may forget the words." And then he adds, where can I find a man who has forgotten his words, that I may exchange words with him? There is something fascinatingly paradoxical in the fact that a man like Zhuangzi, who utterly distrusts the ability of language to convey true insight, in his work, characterized by stylistic vigor, lyrical feeling, intractable and sometimes macabre fantasy, sparkling wit and deep empathy, tries to show us poor mortals the way to a true reality beyond the confines of human reason. In his attempts to guide mankind onto the right path, Zhuangzi has created a bewitching dream world, unparalleled in early Chinese literature. At the end of his work, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, Ludwig Wittgenstein urges the reader who has understood his arguments to throw them away in the same way as he should throw away the ladder after he has climbed up on it. If there is a special cloud arbor in heaven reserved for language philosophers, I like to believe that Zhuangzi sits there exchanging silences with Wittgenstein. Thank you. I've got a poor throat. I hope I've been able to make myself understood.
Thank you, Professor Ma, for such an inspiring talk. I think we all enjoy a lot. So now we open to questions. So before you ask your question, please identify yourself first. Is there any question? Let me ask two questions. I'll break the ice. Since you are a professional translator, I would like to hear your comments on the two renditions of Jin Ping Mei. One is translated by Debbie Roy, and the other is translated by Clement Egerton. So can you just give a general comment on these two translations?
Egerton's translation is the older one, and Egerton was not what you would call a scholar, not a literary scholar. His translation was done at a time when he did not have access to the complete version of the Jin Ping Mei Zihua. Roy is a scholar, a literary scholar. He has access to the full version of the Jin Ping Mei, and that must be considered a better and more faithful translation. May I add also the translation of another great work, the Honglo-Meng. The Honglo-Meng has a great many translators. Among them, there is the Reverend Tuba Shi, Yang Xianyi and his wife, who translated the Honglo-Meng. A rather traditional translation. I feel that both have been away from the English language for far too long. Have been living then in Peking several decades. The translation of the Hulaman is, of course, David Hawk's translation with the title "The Story of the Stone," which is a major. It is a tremendous achievement. He left his chair at Oxford University in order to devote all his time to the translation of the Hulaman. When he had done 80 chapters, he gave the rest to be translated by his son-in-law, John Minford. And John Minford continued with this 40. And that is a translation that simply cannot be bettered. No one can ever produce a translation that beats David Hawkes, and no one should try. Talking about going back to the GPMA, I'm very happy. Well, two things give me a great happiness. One is that a student of mine, a few years ago, completed his translation of the Hulaman. It is a very fine translation into Swedish by a scholar who could have made an excellent academic career. He took two doctorates really in French literature, and in one thesis dealt with futuristic poetry in Russia and in Italy, written in Italian. And he was offered a position at his university in Uppsala, but preferred to teach high school. So he was a high school teacher throughout his life, and then he came to me in the late 1970s and wanted to study Chinese, which he did, for the sole purpose of reading and rereading the Hulaman. So he did, and I suggested to him again and again that he should translate the work. He read it 10 times, I think. I said, go on and translate it. No, he said, I can't do that. But then he decided to do that. He was out skating on a lake, a winter day, and he fell into the water. He fell into the water, and then when he was trying to crawl up, he decided that if he survived, he would spend the rest of his life translating the Hulaman. And so he did, an excellent translation. Again, back to Jim May. We have now in Swedish, we have Shihotuan, Shioji, and Hulaman. A Danish colleague of mine is now translating the Jim May. She has studied oral literature for centuries, for decades, and especially the oral performances of an old master in Nanjing, telling the Wuzhu stories and the Xiuji. And she has decided to translate the Jim May, and she's producing 10 chapters a year. So the whole work will take 10 years, 100 chapters. And she's about halfway, and the translation is excellent. So I'm very happy that a very small and insignificant country in Northern Europe, well, I should say the Danish and Swedish, the languages are about the same. It's the dialects of it. So we have in Northern Europe, we now have translations of the 4 major classical Chinese novels, which makes me very, very happy. I'm sorry, I was too wrong. I answered your question too well.
And my second question is, if you look at the 2 translations, how do they deal with the juicy parts, like the pornographic parts of the translation, because since you mentioned that Egerton is not a scholar, but his translation is way more interested in David Roy's translation. So as a reader and as a professional translator, how do you take this?
Well, Professor who mentioned that I started my academic career as a student of Latin, and in Egerton's early translation, all the juicy passages were rendered into quite good Latin. So for me, it was no difficulty. I could read those. And later on, of course, his translation has been modified. The juicy parts have been included in his later translation, and they're not. Yeah. But I don't know. I still think that work of translation of that magnitude must be undertaken by someone who has a sound literary sound grounding in literature, and I think that Roy has that. I remember an Englishman called Bill Jenner. He worked for years at the Wyvern Truman Show as a translator, and then he ended up, I think, as a chair professor at my own university in Canberra, the Australian National University. And he translated the COG. After Anthony Yu had translated it, had presented his translation. And then I asked Jenner, I said, how could you? I mean, Anthony Yu's translation is quite superb. Why do you feel it necessary to translate it anew? He said, you see, I have translated it into English. And that was a very nasty remark. And Jenner is, I think, a very nasty person. And that was a nasty remark. He was suggesting that Anthony Yu's scholarly translation of the COG was not English, or something else. I don't know if you've read Anthony Yu's translation. It is, you may say that it is too scholarly, perhaps. Sometimes scholarship can be driven too far, but his is a very, very piece of scholarly undertaking. And I enjoy that translation better than any other that I have read. Talking about the Sri Hotuan, you may not know that the Pearl Buck, who received the Nobel Prize in 1938 for her novel Dadi, The Good Earth, describing life in rural China in the 1920s. A novel that really was received with great enthusiasm all over the world. And the choice of the Swedish Academy in 1938 has been very, very seriously criticized by amongst other my friends Feng Zhi and Peter Lin, the poets. For Peter Lin suggested to me that this was the worst mistake that the Swedish Academy has ever made, awarding the Nobel Prize to Pearl Buck. But it wasn't that I wanted to talk about. I wanted to mention the fact that Pearl Buck translated the Sri Hotuan into English. But she was fluent in spoken Chinese, but she couldn't read Chinese. She had spent many years in China. Her father was a missionary. She was brought up in China and spoke it fluently, but couldn't read. So she had a teacher who sat by her side and helped her translating the Shuhuduan. And that is some gruesome mistakes. I mean, if the text speaks about a lacquer table, she will translate as seven tables, and on every page, I mean, there are any number of these mistakes, but translation is a hard work, and any translator is bound to make mistakes. There's no such thing as a perfect translator.
Thank you. I think I talked too much, so I'll just shut up and give you guys more time.
Thank you, Professor. I'm from Translation Department from this university. Thank you for your speech. I really enjoy it. So from your speech, I feel that you are suggesting that in a way a translator cares about the process of translation. He cares about the author, and also he focuses on how to render the original meaning into the translation, into the source target text. But in a way, I think you're also suggesting in the end of your text that a translator is when he produces the translation as a product, the product has come out to be the product itself, right? It's not a kind of attached work of the original text. So, as the topic of your speech is on the art of translation, so I'm thinking that probably you can provide us some opinions about what does it mean in terms of the idea of art of translation. Because if you're focusing on the first part, like translation as a process, you're always the slave of the original text. You can never surpass the original writer. And I think that's in a way or another contradictory to the art, the concept of art itself. But if you look at the product itself, like a Lin Shu's translation, yeah, we can say it is an art because it's introduced people the ideas of some Western culture and the elements, and try to bring them in to really understand what the Western culture might suggest or indicate. But if you only look at translation as a process, I think that maybe have some negative effect to the translator's role, because the translator has put so much effort in those brainstorming and play of the words. So I think the translators deserve of some kind of status in this translation activity. So I want to know about your opinions. Thank you.
I think I should have avoided using the term art, the art of translation. Instead, I should have spoken of the craft of translation. I think I do insist that translation is a craft, and that ideally the translator is a highly skilled craftsman. But to me, a highly skilled craftsman is on the level of the creator. They are both performing excellently in their own way, but one is a creator and one is a skillful craftsman. I'm not playing down the importance of the translator. I think that the translator has a tremendously important role in this world in which we live. The former permanent secretary of the Swedish Academy said once, world literature is translation. Translation is world literature. Without translation, no world literature. And that is very true. So the role of the translator is exceedingly important as a bridging across languages. So it would be far from my mind to to lower my estimation of the importance of translators. They are important, and they are increasingly important in this world. Yes, I insist that discussing translation, I think you have to discuss the very process of translating. When I stress the great danger of a translator taking over the role of the poet, that is a very, very great danger. Very often you find that poets also work as translators, and that can be very dangerous. There is an American poet, quite a good poet, who has translated a great deal of the Swedish Nobel Prize winner Thomas Tranströmer's poetry. His name is Fulton. Robert Bly. Robert Bly. And he's a poet. And he takes a poet's liberties with the text, which no translator worth his name would dare to take. Tranströmer has one poem called Barakilev's Dream. Barakilev was a Russian composer. Barakilev's Dream. And in that very long poem, there are two verses that go like this in Swedish. Det var ett fält. På fältet stod en plog. Och plogen var en fågel som störtat. And that I will translate as follows. There was a field. In the field there was a plough. And the plough was a bird that had crashed to the ground. The plough was a bird that had crashed to the ground. And there you see the crashed bird. You see the plough in the field with one hand against the ground and the other in a 45-degree angle towards the sky. It's a very dramatic image of the plough being a bird that had crashed. Now, Robert Bly does the following. There was a field. In the field there was a plough. And the plough was a bird just rising from the ground. What do you see there? You see a plough standing in a completely unnatural way in the field, like this. Just like a bird just leaving the ground. He is killing the image of Tranströmer, who has a bird lying there, dead, in the ground, crashed. And instead presenting a bird just rising into the air. That to me is dishonest. He is doing something that to me is equally bad as when Evan King translated Låt oss chanser, Lars's novel, with a very, very tragic ending. An ending that didn't suit the American reader, according to the publisher. So the publisher had the translator rewrite the last chapter into an optimistic Hollywood ending. Låt oss chanser. He runs to the brothel where the girl he loves is living. And he grabs her by the hand, and together they run to the glorious future. In that one chapter, the last chapter, the translator completely kills Lars's novel, in the same way as Robert Bly kills Trousdottir's image of the crashed bird. And that is why I insist very strongly that poets should confine themselves to writing poetry, and they should not translate. And if they do translate, they should not excel over the original poet or writer. I get quite upset when I talk about these things.
Any more questions? Here.
Thank you very much for your talk. I don't really have any questions, but maybe a comment. To me, it seems like a classic work like Hong Lo Meng. There shouldn't be just one standard translation, but maybe like the Iliad, there should be 10 or 20, and they should be revised over the years. And I think sometimes if we try to be faithful, too faithful to a text, we end up being slaves to the text. And the result is that the translation is dead and lifeless. And I'm reminded of some comments by Gao Xingjian on translation, because I forget if he wrote some works in French first and then translated them, or if it was Chinese and then into French. But he said when he was translating his own works, he tried not to be too faithful. Or he said if he was too faithful, he just didn't like the result. And also that quote about Dickens that you read to us, you said Arthur Waley really thought it was an improvement. And so I just wonder, do you think your philosophy of translation is maybe you revere the source text maybe too highly, or do we have to respect the source text that much? Because sometimes if you adapt, it's like, you adapt it to a new environment. And is that really bad? I mean, do we have to be faithful? Is that the first requirement of a translator, in your view?
I think I agree with you that we need more than one translation of important works. And I guess that a translation has a lifetime of sometimes 30 years. After 30 years, the time has come. I mean, the target language has changed quite a lot, perhaps, in 30 or 40 years. And there is time for a new translation. But I think that the original work must always remain there as a you mustn't you can change in the target language, but you must not interfere with the original. I think so. And I remember when I translated the Svihojuan, there was a review asking the question, when you read a translation of a novel conceived in the novel from, say, the early 15th century, should the age and the milieu of that original text shine through in your translation? You very often find Pearl Buck, for instance, in her translation of the Svihojuan, she used a kind of archaic, what she believed was a kind of archaic English syntax. And why? because the text she translated was written, say, 500 years ago, and therefore she must use an old kind of language too. But she did not realize that the original writer of the Shuhudan, whoever it was, established a kind of a dialogue between his text and his readers. Whenever you read a work like that, you engage in a dialogue with the author of the text, or with the text itself. And that dialogue, in the case of Shuhudan, is carried out in a oral language, in a language of that time, in a language that wasn't in any way antiquated when the dialogue was presented. And the task of the translator is to establish a dialogue between his translation and his readers, which is on the same level as the original dialogue. And therefore, one mustn't use, however old the text may be, you mustn't use archaisms in order to show the reader that this is a very old text. You must use a language that is living in the day when the translation is read. I think that is important.
We still have 5 more minutes, so one last question. So please take the chance. Otherwise, you have to fly to Sweden to ask him in person. Anyone?
You mentioned that Lily Tang is a very important person for you. Do you know that he translated or rewriting the Hong Roman in English? Do you know Lily Tang?
Yeah.
Translate or rewriting in English the Hong Roman?
Did he?
Yes. Yeah, this is I think a very important case for us because Lily Tang studied Hong Roman maybe about more than 20 years, and he translated. And
did he publish his translation?
No, that's the key point. I don't know what the problem of his version or translation, but it's not published in English. But the manuscripts was passed to his Japanese translator and translated into Japanese and published. And so I think to find out the Lily Tang's the English version is very important.
Yeah.
But I don't know where is the manuscript. That is the interesting case.
Yeah. Because to me, I mean, the Lily Tang's command of English was better than most exceedingly well-educated Britishers' command of their native language. He had a tremendous command of it. And unfortunately, he didn't really care about the translations of his own works into Chinese. I mean, his 生活的艺术, the importance of living, which is the title he used when he wrote the work in English, is superb. But the Chinese version, 生活的艺术, I think is much inferior. I don't know who translated it. He didn't do it himself. And the same is true of his novel published under the title A Moment in Peking. And that again was translated into Chinese, but that Chinese is not, the Chinese version is not as excellent as his original Chinese. He was a great, gifted linguist.
But I think the moment in Peking, actually he selected the translator.
Oh, he did.
And pay him well. This is the record.
I'm not saying it's a poor translation, but it's not as good as it could have been. And I don't know about Liu Tang's command of Chinese. He wrote a great deal in Chinese too, but I have read too little of his original works in Chinese. It was Paul Bach who advised him to publish in Chinese. They were very good friends, and Paul Bach twice in 1940 and in 1950, Tujian suggested Liu Tang as a candidate for the Nobel Prize, and oddly enough, the Swedish Academy said that yes, this is very fine, excellent work, great humor, but since they are written in English, they cannot be representative of Chinese literature, and that I think is a quite unfair comment, because when Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian poet, received the Nobel Prize in 1913, he was given that for his poetry originally written in English. So in that case, they accepted it, but not in the case of Liu Tang. He should have gotten, but he had that against him, that in the years 1940 to 43, there was no prize, no Nobel Prize awarded during the war. If prizes had been given, it may well be that the Swedish Academy would have to rethink and give him a prize. It would be very well worth it, I think.
Okay, our time is up, so I guess let's all give a big warm round of applause to Professor Malmqvist.
他现在就是说英文没有最好，可是他因为他在日本有一个公司的关系，他就所以说现在有集体的英译。